My name is Katie, and I was born with a rare and life-threatening birth defect known as Congenital Diaphragmatic Hernia, or CDH. CDH is as common as spina bifida, muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, and some other well-known defects, but very few have ever heard of CDH. The following is a short video about this birth defect and my fight to survive as baby, narrated by my daddy.
Congenital diaphragmatic hernia is a birth defect. It's a birth defect that happens very early in gestation.
The diaphragm doesn't form properly between 9 and 10 weeks of gestational age.
There's a hole in the diaphragm muscle, usually on the left side, that has catastrophic effects before birth.
An event happens where abdominal contents move into the chest.
The intestine and other organs in the abdomen can go up through this defect into the chest and compress the developing lungs.
Because there's so much other tissue in the chest, the lungs can't expand and grow and develop normally.
It's of little consequence before birth for the baby getting oxygen and that sort of thing, but the real road test begins at the time of birth when the umbilical cord is clamped and those small lungs have to work.
Most CDH babies are diagnosed during routine ultrasounds taken during pregnancy. Katie was one of the exceptions. Shortly after she was born at Rex, it was assumed that she had a collapsed lung, since the doctors and nurses could hear no lung sounds on her right side. However, X-ray results showed that she had a right side diaphragmatic hernia. She was immediately placed on a ventilator, and within an hour, Katie was life-flighted to Duke. Once at Duke, it took several hours to stabilize Katie. She was placed on a high-frequency ventilator that made her take 420 breaths per minute, along with insertion of several arterial PICC lines, umbilical lines, and IVs. Her small lung capacity could not absorb enough oxygen and expel enough CO2 to survive without being placed on a mixture of oxygen and nitrous oxide. It was during these early hours that we learned that even with modern medicine, only 50% of babies born with a diaphragmatic hernia survive. It took 6 days to stabilize Katie for the surgery that would be necessary to save her life.
The surgery involves an incision, usually just below the rib cage. The goals of the surgery are to take all the stuff that's up in the chest and bring it down into the belly, and then to close that hole that's in the diaphragm.
If there's a small hole with a rim of muscle all the way around, one can just simply close the hole by sewing the rim of muscle together. Those are usually much more favorable cases. For those babies with large defects or who have complete lack of a diaphragm on that side, those are even more tricky surgically because one needs to place a patch, usually a Gore-Tex patch. A Gore-Tex patch used for repair of a large diaphragmatic defect is sewn to whatever tissue is there. There may be a rim of muscle partially. It may need to be sewn to the rib. One thing we need to watch long term is, of course, the baby is going to grow. The patch is not going to grow, so it's very important these babies be followed long term so that we can see whether or not the patch will tear away from the body wall on the inside and lead to a recurrent hernia problem.
The one thing that we found is most important, though, is to be sure they're really stable enough to undergo the surgery, because there's really no rush to get in there if they're not perfectly stable.
It was discovered during Katie's surgical repair that her left lung was almost normal in size, but her right lung was only about as big as the end of a thumb. This equaled about 1/3 of the size it should be. The successful surgery was a milestone for Katie, just as with every other CDH survivor. It meant that she would soon breathe on her own without the assistance of a ventilator. It also began the long road to recovery. 2 days after her surgical repair, Katie was successfully weaned from the ventilator, and we were able to hear her cry for the first time. Many CDH babies have feeding aversions, coupled with sometimes severe cases of reflux. Katie had to be taught how to eat. During this time, Katie got most of her nutrients through a nasogastric tube, which deposited the milk directly into her stomach. The painfully slow process of teaching her how to eat took over 3 weeks to accomplish. As with any other surgery, CDH babies require lots of medication. As these were slowly withdrawn, Katie went through an unpleasant period of narcotics withdrawal. Katie required several months of physical therapy to be able to open her hands. After 6 weeks in the intensive care nursery, Katie was released to go home. Since that time, Katie has been closely monitored by her physicians at Duke. Hopefully, through this brief informational video, you have become a bit more aware of this little-known birth defect and understand that those children who survive being born with a congenital diaphragmatic hernia often endure long and expensive hospital stays, sometimes multiple surgical repairs, and a lifetime of enduring the effects. When you see or wear turquoise, be reminded and tell others about CDH, so that hopefully prevention, better treatments, and a cure can be found.